Welcome back to the House of Kayfabe here on YouTube. I am Adam Harris. In this corner, the most professional lawyer in all of professional wrestling. The only Steven New that matters is what I was about to say. And the other Steve, the Junk Drummer TV, is in the House of Kayfabe. And we are going to talk about the good, the bad, and there's a little bit of ugly when it comes to the Dark Side of the Ring Season 4. Man, I really loved Season 1, and also Season 2 came about in the height of the pandemic, and it was almost like that was our the last dance of Jordan. It was like we were waiting every Tuesday for that episode to drop, right? It was like,
oh yeah, it was
waiting for that content.
TV.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And then season 3 was a great follow up, and this season, there's a lot to digest about it, and we've got Stephen P. New and the other Steve in the House of Kayfabe, and we're going to talk about the good and the bad and the ugly. Thanks for watching here on the House of Kayfabe. Be sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching along. Stephen P. New, season 4 just wrapped up with the Marty Jannetty episode, and just wondering, what do you think of maybe your top favorite of the whole season was? What part did you enjoy the most?
Well, Barker makes fun of me for being a Pollyanna a lot, and believing in the kayfabe. So I'm going to say that the Magnum TA episode was my favorite episode. It was the only what I feel like really feel good episode. JYD could have been, but I think they shortchanged Sylvester a little bit there, and with Dog's problems. And man, Magnum TA is the Lou Gehrig of professional wrestling, right? He's what should have been, what could have been with Magnum. And Terry is still with us. If you go to these conventions, like at the Bash and Beckley in June, Terry Allen was with us. At the Gathering a couple weeks ago in Charlotte, Terry Allen was there. He's been at WrestleCade with us. And I remember Steve Barker looking across the aisle from us a year or two ago going, oh my God, man, that's Magnum TA right across the way over there. And Barker was just totally marking out. But Terry Allen is still with us. He's a success story. He's been successful in business. And I'll take the story of that car wreck and that real weird sort of product liability issue. I wish Terry would have sued the maker of the car. But anyway, that was my favorite episode of the season. And the rest, man, it's hard to watch some of those. And Adam, I'll tell you, I told Barker, I've got some inside scoop. I feel like our viewers sometimes want me to come on here and divulge attorney-client
spill the tea
information and spill.
This is Stephen P. New watching Dark Side 4.
Yes, and so, but I've got some inside baseball that I don't think Tammy will mind me sharing, and some other things from Abdullah's GoFundMe campaign last year that I'm gonna give our viewers a little bit of some inside baseball there.
Okay, cool. Well, we have that to look forward to, man. And I know I really enjoyed the Magnum TA episode for the same things you said, which is, there was a lot of hope and recovery, and it all ends well. And he's famous still for going to these signings and doing lots of meet and greets, and he makes the rounds still to this day and still has lines, man. Tons of people like you, Steve Barker, are dying to meet Magnum TA. So I presume that was one of your favorite episodes as well, man. Did you learn anything from that, or was it everything you hoped it would be?
Man, what was the best part about that is why we love wrestling is the nostalgia. If you've been doing it as long as we have, and me and Steve are the two seasoned veterans in this podcast.
That's and real gray hair there, ladies and gentlemen.
Right
That's
here,
not fake.
Right there too. And if I had some of this, it'd be there too. When I was watching the Magnum TA, I was just watching shit I'd already seen. Like all of that footage. Like, I don't know if they showed the Tully Blanchard I Quit match, but seemed like they did. I saw all that in real time, and I saw Magnum TA at a house show in like 85 because I don't think
awesome.
Did we see him in 86 at the American Bash?
I can't remember if I think his accident had already happened.
I think it already happened, which means I'd seen him before that at like 85, 84. So that's the stuff when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. Me and Steve Classic, we fucking loved Dusty Rhodes and Magnum TA. And I specifically remember the first day where I was like, as a 10-year-old being like, man, Ric Flair's pretty good. And my dad did not like that at all. He was pissed. He was like, I am failing as a father if my son thinks Ric Flair is the good guy, because obviously Magnum TA and Dusty Rhodes, right? That was a feel good story. You know, we have a older episode a couple weeks back where we had a same crew here. We talked about how I thought Dark Side of the Ring, and especially this season, had been maybe bad for business. And I can tell you there was 2 or 3 episodes too in general where I just like felt bad. And I was like, I don't watch wrestling to feel bad. I feel wrestling to, I watch wrestling to feel other things besides depression.
There's a lot for us to comprehend, I think, psychologically as wrestling fans. Like, why does it come to this? Why do we care this much about Grizzly Smith, and like about Chris Benoit and those things? Fascinated. I love those episodes. I'm always anxious to learn more. But like it's wild to think about how thirsty we are as wrestling fans, and that's why a dark side exists. It's taken the best part of the shoot interviews that we know from the internet, kind of the unhinged part, and it's worked it all into like this digestible, easily watched format that we're used to, both on the Vice network and just kind of on documentary style dramatized documentary television. But I also think they've set a few bars for the television era with their reenactments and with the dramatic scenes, the blood raining down all over Abdullah the Butcher in that one episode. But to go back, and one other person, I'm anxious. Did either of you guys see Junkyard Dog live? Because that was another episode that we saw.
Not me.
I don't have. Dog was already gone from WWF by 91, right?
Okay, yeah, definitely. Yeah, he went to WCW sometime around in there, 89 or so, or 90. So I saw a
WCW show in Williamson in June of 90. Right, I was just graduating from high school, getting ready to go to Fort Knox for the second time for basic training, and I didn't repeat it, folks. Mine was split between my junior year in high school and my senior year, lest anyone think I washed out of basic training. I passed. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I went to a WCW show in Williamson, West Virginia, to Williamson Fieldhouse in June of 90. God, I thought Dog was on that show, but I'll check that and get back to you guys. It doesn't stand out to me ever seeing Dog. Like Steve's saying, we didn't see Charleston, West Virginia didn't get one of the best of 7 Magnum and Nikita matches, but he was on Great American Bash 86, Steve. Wow. Yes, he was.
Wow. Okay.
85 and 86.
Well, now that you're talking about the Junkyard Dog episode, I think that was maybe one of the most egregious holes in any of their plot lines. Is once I don't know anything about Mid-South. I do now because I went back and watched some documentaries and actually watched some of the TV that's available on the network. There you go.
I've been watching a little Mid-South DVD action.
I'm old. I grew up, and if it didn't come in on an antenna, and when you got your 24 channels of cable, you just didn't get it. But I did and was aware because I was reading the aftermags like crazy. And when JYD went to the WWE, they downplayed and I think they did it for the purposes of besmirching Vince McMahon. And look, you don't have to manufacture anything to besmirch the man. You know what I mean? And I think they wanted to center it around the Tony Atlas line that they could put in all the commercials. A black man can't do what a white man do. That may or may not be true, but one thing that is definitely true is JYD was the number 2 baby face when he was a WWE. They made it look like he was a jabroni. Like
they made him seem like a popular black guy, but he was a popular wrestler.
He was number 2. He was number 2.
Let's set it up just a little bit, guys. When you talk about Mid-South wrestling, when they had their big super shows, they were in the Superdome. Now, they didn't run the Superdome in New Orleans all the time. They ran at like University of New Orleans, which is kind of on the black side of town, and the black people could walk from the community to UNO. And JYD was over in Mid-South, and that's the reason why. To understand the history of this, Bill Watts is selling out the freaking Superdome with like 60,000 people or whatever. And Vince McMahon starts doing this thing called All American Wrestling on Sundays at noon on the USA Network, and he tells the promoters, "Hey, pal, send me your wrestlers, send me clips of your best matches, and I'll show them on Sunday from all of the territories." What he did was actually he was seeing who's the most over, who's the best wrestler in their territories, and that's how JYD ended up.
Scouted some talent.
And he scouted some talent, scooped them up, and JYD, boom, before you know it, he's out of Mid-South. He's in WWF. But to Steve Barker's point, there was nobody any more over in WWF. I would probably say Hogan, JYD, and probably Superfly were the top three in that like 84, 85, 86 time period there, before Macho, before the Ultimate Warrior, and the 87, 88, 89 period. Man, JYD was over. If you don't believe me, go back and watch the wrestling cartoon on Saturday morning.
Damn it, you got me. I was
And
about to say he was on a motherfucking cartoon on
Saturday
Saturday
morning
mornings that I watched.
And the first huge line of wrestling figures, the two biggest baby faces and probably the best sellers were Hulk Hogan and JYD when the LJNs hit the
Was
show.
he first series?
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
And I think you guys are correct that, and I don't know if WWE had input into that or whatever, but they shouldn't have shortchanged. They should have had some subject matter expert on Dog in the WWF at that time, someone who was knowledgeable with just how over he was.
They know, and I'm not going to get too political. I think that they were just trying to, how can I put this?
Sell the racism.
Filter
angle.
it. They wanted to sell the racism.
They were trying to make that into maybe perhaps more than it was. We weren't there, but I mean, also JR. That was one of the most memorable quotes is from JR, who said each territory had their top black baby face, and that's just the way it was, and there was only room for one. And he said it's hurtful. It's hard to just think about it that way, but that's how things were back then. And JYD was the tops back then.
But the thing is, the fucking marks didn't give a shit. You know what I mean?
No,
we didn't care.
You can't tell me that JYD and Coco Beware and Tony Atlas could all exist in the same universe.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's it. That was on them. They're on Vice. And they have to sell that. They have an ideology. They have to, and to their credit, it's the first time they've really brought it up. You know what I mean? Because like Tony Atlas, don't act like we don't know some of your horrendous backstage stuff. Like you're this fucking angel. You know what I mean? Maybe it's because you're fucking up, and maybe it's not because of what you are. You know what I mean, dude? Like, come on, stop it. Just stop. Right. Now, here's one that I think that we all can agree on. Is the bash at the beach. Dude, Adam, tell us, bro, how much you loved Bash at the Beach 2000.
Well, and I wasn't even really watching WCW at this time. I think the lore has grown so much over the years that the Bash and Beckley is actually more memorable now than it was when it actually happened.
Did you say Bash and Beckley?
I'm sorry, Bash. The Bash at the Beach. Hey, I know my loyalties.
Who aren't in Southern West Virginia or familiar with Southern West Virginia, where Adam and I live and where Barker is from, there are no beaches. There are no beaches.
That's right.
Beach Fork
on the New River.
Beach Fork.
That's right.
No beaches on the Ohio River, though, where Barker lives now.
No.
But some of the things that were absent from the Bash at the Beach episode are, more of the death and suffering and the children watching their parents suffer and that sort of thing. That's why I think I love that episode so much, is that it was like a little harmless. Like, yeah, they did horrible business for wrestling, but actually nobody died. There's no sob stories. There's no funerals involved, other than the career of maybe perhaps Vince Russo or Eric Bischoff on this one. But I loved the Bash and the Beach episode. I really did, and I think it pointed to a time period that is hard to grasp. Also, like that was definitely an era, the beginning of the internet. The fact that Hulk, got off a plane and his pager started blowing up. I love those sort of elements that like sort of tell where wrestling was.
Right.
Pop culture scheme.
And for those of you who may be a little younger, I hope we have younger viewers watching as well. But there was this big thing in the 90s called Synergy, and all of the corporations were all about synergy. So AOL Time Warner owned WCW at this time. So the idea, the corporate idea behind that was that AOL would have it on the internet, and Time Warner, Time Magazine. Well, you can go show WCW in Time Magazine. Get out. And Warner Brothers Music. Well, Warner Brothers Music didn't have anything to do with WCW either. So you get this huge multinational corporation owning a wrestling company. And that was the difference in 2000. WWF was still a closely held, family owned company. And on the other side, you have a large multinational corporation doesn't know what the hell to do with a wrestling company that started out as Georgia Championship Wrestling. And so when I think of that time, I'd been practicing law 2 years, and so I just think about corporately where they were and why. I don't know it would have mattered how good in the ring the stuff was or how good the storylines were or anything else like that. I think that WCW was going to swirl the drain just as soon as the great big corporation bought it.
Well, and so where I'll go from that is that, you're right. And there was a legacy of professional wrestling on TNT and on TBS. And that's kind of why it was a big deal that some fans probably don't even realize that Tony Khan brought AEW back to the Turner networks. And that was a big deal. It matters to the history of professional wrestling in the grand scheme of things. I think that matters. And so I think it's good to tell that story as well. I was going to transition also to talking about somebody that I did see live and in person. And it was the most anticipated episode for me. And it's one I think you have a lot of insight on, Stephen Pinu. And I thought it held up. I thought it did a lot of good for the overall memory of Chris Candido and of Tammy Sitch. Maybe Chris more than Tammy, that's for sure. But one of the things I was hopeful, and I think they accomplished, was to maybe help cement Chris Candido's name and record and body of work as one of the greats, not just one of the most underrated, like everybody says, but as one of the greats and the most respected talents to ever grace the squared circle.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Jim Cornette and I are close. And when you see Jim Cornette get that choked up, you know that something's going on. I mean, Corny doesn't get that emotional. It's real, how he felt about Chris Candido, and the fact that, Candido came down to Knoxville, got his start in Smoky Mountain and everything like that. And it's kind of how the story unfolded. Let me give you guys a little bit of the inside baseball if I can. Late last year, Evan Husney reached out to me and asked if I could serve as a conduit between him and Tamara Sitch. I'm not representing Tamara Sitch right now, obviously, on her charges in Florida, but I have in the past. So Evan asked if I could coordinate what Tammy wanted this episode to be like and to be about. And Dark Side's original intent was to do a multi-part episode. It would have been a lot longer. They had enough for 2, possibly 3 episodes, 3 parts of Tammy and Chris, or Chris and Tammy. And for reasons that I won't get into the details, it ended up being a 1-part episode focused primarily on Chris.
So they wanted it to be a more Tammy heavy subject matter, right?
No, they wanted, if it was going to be 3, they were going to do about an hour and a half on each one. If it was going to be 2, it would have been about an hour on each one. And they really wanted kind of to explore, Tammy's legal problems. And the issue that Tammy had was she didn't want it to just be focused on 2000 to 2020 or 2022 and all the legal problems and the issues.
after he passed away or after he's
right. She would have rather focused on 92 to 2000, obviously, and they just couldn't reach a deal on the scope of hers, and so they just kind of smushed them together. It was fun to talk to those guys, and I mean they were great. They also wanted to interview Tammy in prison, and she can't get a makeover, so she doesn't look like Sunny, and so I think
she wasn't down with that.
Right, she wasn't going to be. If she couldn't get hair and makeup, then she probably didn't want to be filmed for this episode of Dark Side of the Ring.
I think that's cool that they reached out to you, and you've helped bring Tammy to AESW and also to WrestleCade before, and still an immensely successful talent and a draw for any of wrestling convention. But I think that it's important to point out that you guys worked together, of course, over the years, but also it's cool that Husney reached out to you, and I think we should give them a shout out at least to thank you for the content, whether it was perfect or not. No matter what we say, like I've never done 4 seasons of Dark Side of the Ring, and I think that for them to show their passion and give us wrestling fans something to devour, especially again during the pandemic, I've just felt like it was like a lifeline for us, just like to have something to look forward to. Those of us who were able to have something to look forward to. And I think they did a great job overall. I think their format and their formula works really well for compelling television.
Right, absolutely. And didn't you just feel so sorry? The three of us have gotten to know Francine from the appearances at WrestleCade, and she and Steve Barker,
close personal friends,
BFFs,
friends. And the Francine segment, knowing her, having applied for her trademark for her Queen of Extreme, that was heartbreaking. It really was. And in particular, she and I talked after that. She said the weirdest thing was it wasn't any of the kind of the lifestyle choices that hurt Chris. It was this weird accident kind of a thing.
Well, I will say that Tammy dodged bullets in this episode, because if we've watched any of the shoots, particularly ones with Kevin Nash in them when he's fucked up in a hotel room, she could have been buried far more than the boys over at Vice if they wanted to, because she, my dad said it's one of the Steve Classic's classic lines: nothing ruins a good man like a bad woman. And I don't think I'm going out on a limb by calling Tammy a bad woman. Not just the fact that she probably maybe killed a guy, but the fact that she was servicing wrestlers when her boyfriend, who got her in the business, is in the ring, which when you think about it is the best time to service a wrestler, because you're not going to get caught. She dodged bullets, and that
at least for 8 minutes. You got 8 minutes.
Got 8 minutes plus intros. That one kind of, because they danced around it. They've uncovered far more dubious things about wrestlers, and they let her off with a warning, if you ask me.
Here's what the plan was going to be, I think, was to let Tammy hear some of the things that have been said. I think a great episode, Evan Husney, call me, you got my number. I think a great episode would be to face Tammy with things that people have said, things that people have accused her of, and, give her the trial of Tamara Sitch.
For the right money, she'd totally do it.
Trial of Tamara Sitch. I'll defend her, and I'll sit beside her while a prosecuting attorney from the wrestling industry
reads mean tweets.
Or old shoot video clips, from guys like Kevin Nash. And Tammy, you've got 5 minutes. Give us your version.
That's the darkest side of the ring, perhaps.
And then have a nationwide vote. You've got 24 hours. Call 1-900 Steve New and give us your vote. Is she guilty or innocent?
Well,
All right,
I think that'd
so-
be pretty easy. I think that the positive of that episode's and it's the reason why they started out so strong was they're so good at stories. You know, they're telling
Yeah.
stories about storytellers, and they were able to get across that a big portion of what we call modern wrestling runs right through Chris Candido. So
Daggone
that
right.
was a positive.
Definitely.
One of the positives of this season.
know,
So
the
many wrestlers walk the
undersized
road
guy-
that he paved, I think is how they kind of put it. It's like there are
Yes,
so many
the
wrestlers
undersized
today.
guy doing the maneuvers.
Yeah.
You know, he absolutely paved the road. And guys, one more thing I'd like to say about that episode: his brother and his mom in that
Awesome.
room that they've preserved like a
Yeah.
shrine.
Probably the highlight of the season.
Oh
Yeah. I give you
my
that.
gosh, that room that is preserved like a shrine. I mean, and you see my man cave here.
Mhm,
mean,
mhm.
If
Yeah, I was
somebody-
like, oh, Chris Candido's one of us. He was one of us.
Yes, I mean, with his little wrestling art and stuff, you know, that he drew and his homemade wrestling gear and what have you. I mean, he dreamed of living that life.
I
He
definitely
dreamed of
I did the same myself, and I have a couple cool items of things that I drew and came up with as a kid. And I still have my first card album of wrestling cards that I drew a cover on, because it wasn't the one that you couldn't. I wasn't able to get the one that said wrestling cards on the front of it, you know, from WWF. So I copied it out of the catalog, right, and I drew it myself and taped it on the front of my binder. But I will say there was a lot of episodes I was looking forward to, and we're going to wrap this up, I think, by talking about one of us, one of the more controversial ones. But I really was looking forward to the Bam Bam episode. I was also really looking forward to the Matt Bourne episode. And again, you can only do so much in a 60-minute documentary. I think Matt Bourne had a career, like a lot of the Portland stuff was just overlooked. You know, like Buddy Rose married Matt Bourne's sister. And I think because they talked about that on the Tales of the Territories, that perhaps they decided to skip over some of that. But I thought overall those episodes were great, and the same with the Adrian Adonis episode. But somebody who, you mentioned, Barker, that they didn't bury Tammy as hard as they could have, but did they bury Abdullah the Butcher as hard as they could have on this episode? Did
And
they
if
bury...
And if they would have Abdullah the Butcher been smart enough to know it? Man. I mean, dude.
More questions than answers, I think, coming out of the Abdullah episode.
That's the worst episode. And of course, Steve News got some more tea to spill on that one. That one was disjointed. I don't really know what the story they were trying to tell. It was very much a Tony Khan booked affair, if you ask me. I know that they were wanting to get.
Well, and it's cool that Hannibal sponsored the last half.
Well, that's what I was about to say. You could tell that they just really wanted to tell the story of Devin, Stevens' buddy. Is
that your rat story?
I can't stand that motherfucker. I hated him before he criminally abused a referee. He's been a moron forever. He's the only guy that makes Conrad seem intelligent. The thing about the Abdullah episode was they were just everywhere. There was no through line. We would go back and forth. Of course, God Emperor talked about it as well in his podcast. I didn't get it. I remember watching Abdullah. I remember him in World Class. I remember seeing an Abdullah Bruiser Brody match in a World Class. So I had experienced him before. I, of course, am one of the few members of the House of Kayfabe podcast that does not like garbage wrestling, and Abdullah is one of the grandfathers of that blight that is on this profession that we love. So I've never been a big fan of his. Okay, you're a big fat guy, and you go in there and you slice your fucking head up.
Yeah, but
it's like going to the carnival.
Then I mean, people scattered.
It was.
I mean, that's the truth. Like him and Brody, you know what I mean? Like people got out of the way. It'll never happen again like that. It'll never.
You're right.
Happen like that.
I'll give you that. No, ain't nobody scared of Nick Gage, so I mean, I understand that part. And
no, they crowd around him. They basically he can crowd surf with them.
Catch hepatitis just standing next to that motherfucker.
And that was part of the whole thing. Was like it went. That you're right. It did jump all over the place because it was like they said Abdullah made the most money. Nobody was making more than Abdullah. And then you've got his housekeeper showing photos of the mold in his house, and if that's actually the case, and he hasn't had better, management or better any better advice than that, I feel really terrible. And that's what I don't like about Dark Side of the Ring, is that it kind of reveals these harder parts about our heroes, or about the people that we've had this elevated perspective of. This you know what I'm saying, like this elevated, these are our heroes, or the magical figures of our youth and stuff, and they're living hard lives, man.
Yeah. I will tell you, Abdullah proclaims to be illiterate. I take him at his word, and he says that's the reason why he didn't understand what he was getting in the mail when Devon filed the lawsuit against him in Canada. Now, I believe Abdullah's still a Canadian citizen. I don't know whether he still has a Canadian residence as well as his residence in the greater Atlanta area. But so Devon gets a judgment by default against Abdullah the Butcher in Canada. It's about like 1.4 million or something like that. And what you have to do in that situation, you have to go through an international legal process, and you domesticate that judgment in the United States. Or if you have a judgment against a Canadian company in the US, you go up, you domesticate it in Canada.
Only on the House of Kayfabe do you get this kind of insight here, folks.
Calgary, Alberta.
Two things before you go, because this, of course, is some videos that we do. Explain to us default judgment and domesticate. And explain it to us like we're five.
All right.
Put the ad right here.
Now, you file a lawsuit, and the person doing that is called the plaintiff, the person who brings the lawsuit. I'm a plaintiff's lawyer. I sue other people. The person being sued is called the defendant. And the defendant has X number of days to respond to the lawsuit. 20 if you are an individual in the United States, state of West Virginia. 30 if you're a corporation, typically. And so when Devon filed his lawsuit in Canada, Abdullah had X number of days to respond to that lawsuit. And the only thing that you have to respond, if Abdullah would simply have sent a letter on a notebook sheet in handwriting saying, I deny all of the allegations made by Slow Devon in his lawsuit filed on date, signed Abdullah the Butcher. Sent that to the court. That would have qualified as an answer and a response to the lawsuit. But when any defendant fails to file such a document denying the allegations made in the lawsuit, after a period of time, the plaintiff can move for judgment by default. So you win on, and it never gets really tried. What the plaintiff has said in the lawsuit has to be accepted as true at that point. There was no trial. There was no evidentiary backup. It was all allegations. But because the plaintiff wins by default and gets a default judgment, it has to be accepted as true at that point. It could have been 100% false, but because the defendant didn't respond to the lawsuit, the plaintiff wins by default.
So is anybody shocked that the wild man from the Sudan couldn't understand this process?
Man, Mick Foley said he saw him read menus, whatever. So Steve New, you're saying that he would, like, if all he needed was to say, "Hey, I didn't do this," so.
And it would have at least moved forward to a trial. You know,
there was no trial.
There was no trial. It was judgment by default.
So that's what, okay. And then when you said that it needed to be
domesticated, so there's a judgment in whatever province, Canada, right? It's like our states. And so it's a Canadian judgment in Canadian money in whatever province up there. And you can hire lawyers in Atlanta who can take the Canadian judgment, and you file an action in Fulton County, Georgia. Shout out Fulton County. But you file that action down there, and you say, look, there's a person that lives in this county with a Canadian judgment against them. Your Honor, domesticate or bring this judgment to Fulton County, Georgia, so that it can be then executed upon. And so there's really not a whole lot. You don't get a second bite at the apple. It's basically a form process where the judge goes, all right, that's a legitimate verdict in Canada. We're going to domesticate it in the state of Georgia. And then once you get that domesticated, it then becomes a Georgia judgment. So now you've got a Georgia judgment against a Georgia citizen, and you can start doing all of the stuff to collect that Georgia judgment that you could do if you'd gotten the judgment right there in his home county to begin with, which is things like sell his house, sell his stuff, take his name, take his goodwill. And
can you take a trademark as payment?
Anything that has value. If a court were to come in, because anything that would have value, you can try to execute upon.
Holy shit! So,
so you're saying if Slow Devin had done that, he might have been able to recoup some of what appears to be, he hasn't recouped anything?
Well, I don't know where it stands right now. There was a GoFundMe effort last year to hire Abdullah counsel to try to help him with all of these legal problems. That didn't work out for me. And I don't know where it currently stands, but I know there were negotiations going on. I know that Slow Devin and his lawyers were at least being reasonable. When I last knew of this last spring or summer, I think, they were at least being reasonable. It wasn't like they were trying to put Abdullah out on the street or anything like that. And, that legal story was more interesting than, what's gone on legally has been more interesting than what they showed in the episode,
It seemed to have been pretty easy as someone who just took a few law classes and then dropped out of law school to at least cast any kind of doubt. Because that's a big leap to say that you got hepatitis from a dirty razor blade. Now, I know you're not a defendant lawyer, but I know you have to think like one. Would it have been feasible to get some reasonable doubt that that's how he contracted it?
Here's the thing. It's not Abdullah's job to disprove Slow Devin's case. It's Slow Devin's job in a civil lawsuit to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that which he claims. So, and preponderance of the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, is about 50.01%. More likely than not, yes, no. If it's 51% in my favor, I win big dollars. Okay? So,
Johnny Football.
That's right. Slow Devin would have to prove that, yes, this happened, and that's how I contracted that. And he would have to bring medical experts in. And the problem with Slow Devin's allegations is loss of evidence.
You didn't have the razor blade.
You didn't have the razor blade. And some can you imagine? I'd love to be a part of that case where you've got some doctor watching a blood match between two people. And here's the other thing that I think Slow Devin would have a hard time proving. He would have to prove that he was Hep C negative
at the time.
Oh
wow! So
when was the last time you had blood work, Slow Devin? Wow. It was 4 years ago. Point. Okay, so you're saying that sometime in the past 4 years, and oh God, I would have loved to have tried that case. But there's so much so interesting. But you'd have brought a doctor in who would be looking at these two people bleeding on each other or something. And I guarantee you, Abdullah could have found some doctor somewhere who could have said, there's no way, beyond a reasonable doubt, there's no way to a reasonable degree of medical certainty that hepatitis C was transmitted during that wrestling match.
Are you saying that there are doctors out there that disagree with with each other?
Oh, absolutely. For a certain amount of money, you can just about find a doctor to say anything.
That's insane. You heard it here first. Right. That's crazy. So I know you're trying to get out of here, but we can't. And I know Matt Mullins, our downed brother, recovering from a surgery, can't be here. But Adam Harris, you can't leave without talking about the Marty party, the grandest episode. It was the perfect one to end the whole season on. Adam, tell me what you think about Marty Jannetty and that episode.
Man. Oh man, it was brutal. It was brutal, man. I mean, we kind of casually joke and laugh about Monty and our friend, the former rocker, and he's kind of like one of those terms we talk about, the Road Warrior pop, and we talk about there's a few of those wrestlers whose names the Dusty position or the the gorilla position. It's like if only a few of those people have been made iconic through a term in the business. And to be a Marty Jannetty in a tag team is so a term. And for many of reasons, some of which they touched on in depth here on the dark side. This was just an episode of delusionment, man. And I feel in the end, just like with the Graham family, man, I feel bad for Marty Jannetty. I'm amazed he's still around. And I come away with a lot of sympathy for these guys, for sure.
I thought it might be, man, now that I think about it, it might be my second favorite episode, because I don't know that much about Marty. What I know about Marty Jannetty is through Matt Mullins, because he is the only Marty Jannetty mark I've ever met and he is the epitome of what wrestlers used to be. They're insane. Like, it's crazy. Like, it's crazy being a pro wrestler. It's even crazier back then. The kind of abuse that those guys would put on their bodies night after night, the kind of partying that they would do. The business, what you can really see with the Marty Jannetty episode is how much different the business has changed. We freak out when we see Sheamus and Drew drinking a pint on Instagram. I'm like, ew, they're partying. Fuck you. Marty Jannetty existed. Are you kidding me?
Well, and thank God social media wasn't around back then. I'm sure they would agree.
Right. It was bad enough just with traditional media, but that you party when you come to the WWF and you last a night. Jimmy Jack Funk comes in offering up shots, and all hell breaks loose. They start throwing shot glasses. People get hurt. And I mean, it was just nuts. But the problem that I had with the Marty Jannetty episode,
not enough Brutus Beefcake's wife.
I know. I know Missy Leslie. There's plenty of her. So, but Marty refuses. Al Snow said Marty refuses to have any touch with reality. Nothing's ever Marty's fault. He's God's something something toy. God's
amusement toy.
God's amusement toy. No, buddy, stuff's not happening to you because God wants to torture you. You make bad decisions. You get on a police motor scooter in India and run over some dude into a fountain.
I tell you back, that was the highlight of the season.
He doesn't even exist in India. He's in a cow pasture somewhere in India. He doesn't exist over there, so he couldn't have been playing amusement toy with you at the India show over there. So it just talk about a complete just
delusion,
lack a delusion. This. And the stuff about he killed the guy for trying to grab his junk in.
See, that part went a little too far for me, and I feel like that was them.
Alley.
Yeah, that was them enabling or endorsing that fact, and I didn't like that part.
I tell you what, I've got a challenge. This is what I think that we should do as the House of Kayfabe. Everybody loves a cold case. I think we need to find the bowling shoe guy family and say, this professional wrestler just admitted to the first-degree murder of your loved one. Would you love to reopen the cold case? Just like that guy did with Snuka in New Jersey, and go to Columbus, Georgia.
This one could have been a two-parter for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
This could have been a two-part. Allegedly, they did that, right? Allegedly, the cops explored to see if there was an actual case here, and they couldn't find any evidence.
It's floating down the Chattahoochee.
Do you know why? You know what that episode really showed is why we don't do chair shots anymore. Like that was what CTE looks like.
Chair shots, though. I mean, it ain't like he worked ECW or anything. I mean, really? I mean, I just think.
I mean, I can
drugs and
understand
partying probably
because of the ankles and the shoulders for a tag team like the Rockers. I understand the shoulder and the ankle injuries, and my God, at some point, those orthopedists in Columbus, Georgia, need to just amputate that thing.
Oh man,
that elephant hoof isn't going to get any better. I'll tell you that. But
did they talk about in the episode? Because I remember watching again. This is me in my youth. I definitely watched the Midnight Rockers wrestle like Brad Ringens and maybe Big Scott Hall in the AWA.
Nice.
I don't know if they mentioned it in that episode, but this is a thing that this is a story that when they said they were going to be the Midnight Rockers, Vern Gagne thought that he meant like old person rockers. That's how fucking out of touch Vern Gagne was in 1986.
Jim Cornette said that they ripped both of us off, man. He ripped off the Rock and Roll and the Midnight in the same swipe.
The same team name, yeah, no doubt. I loved the Rockers, man, and it's wild to think about my evolution as a wrestling fan, to think about in 92 or 91, whatever it was, and the Rockers were tops, man, and they were so good. And Shawn Michaels was one of the first heel turns, you know, I mean, one of the first really prominent heel turns. And on Corny's podcast, they talk about how going through the barbershop window was violent for that time. I mean, violent for that time. And to see Shawn go that direction, and then to have Marty, and for us to be able to look back on those angles and why they didn't work. And, you know, it was supposed to be Shawn and Marty at WrestleMania 9, you know, wouldn't that have been amazing? And to think about amazing, man. And it's still, it's probably never going to happen, but it could still happen.
Let me tell you.
Like, go ahead.
Let me tell you the problem. A guy like Marty Jannetty just never gets it. You guys realize in 2005,
the opportunities,
WWE brought him back with $1 million contract, and that idiot blew it in 3 weeks? Blew $1 million guaranteed contract in 3 weeks.
Your client, Jim Cornette, doesn't believe that there was $1 million contract. He has some speculation about whether there was
whatever it was
whether Marty was offered $1 million, even if it was a third of that, though.
Georgia.
Yeah.
However
even if it was a third,
it was better than what he was doing.
Yeah.
Adam, do you remember what the Bobby Heenan call was right after the barbershop window? He said, do you remember?
It was something about how Jannetty tried to jump through the window.
He's such a coward. He jumped through the window to miss that kick. That's why Bobby Heenan is the greatest.
The greatest of all time, no doubt. I knew he was going to do that. He sold it. He was like, oh, there's tension. And then when he said, I told you they were okay. And then as soon as he kicked him, he's like, I told you he was going to do that. And he's like, Bobby would switch, man, immediately.
Oh, he was the best.
The best.
Oh, man, and we have also covered that on previous episodes of the House of Kayfabe with our leader, Brian Resner. The Mandela effect of, did HBK super kick him through the window?
Right. Or
did he super kick him and then throw him through the window? But everybody remembers Shawn super kicking him through the window, but he didn't.
That's not what it was. Yeah.
That's not
what I love also about that is, and they could have pointed this out. And maybe on one of the outtakes, they asked Barber about this, but man, when he kicks him, Bruce the Barber Beefcake is out of there. Like, he just leaves. Like, oh, you know, if this was your barbershop, you think you'd be a little more concerned about your property, you know? Like, man, that was my window, dude. Like, you can't do that. He just leaves, man. Bruce Barber. Exit stage left.
Ugh, that's funny.
Well, we better exit stage left on this episode. Oh, wait, you got one more. Go for it.
Yeah, the Graham dynasty.
Oh, God.
You know, a lot of people talk about Eddie Graham and the Grahams and Mike Graham. I don't think people get how popular championship wrestling from Florida was, right up until the point where they were kind of absorbed up into Georgia and North Carolina. But man, apparently, like, Florida was it. You know, everybody wanted to be down there. Everybody wanted to be in Tampa. Weather's beautiful. You're going to make a crap ton of money. You never have to leave the Sunshine State. And was just really sad for somebody that, you know, both the McMahons, Vince Sr. and Vince Jr., loved and had this long-term relationship with, that kind of thing. That episode to me was really intriguing and sad all at the same time, you know, with the generational, you've got the pressure to try to do it at the time when the territories are dying, and all that pressure that went on to Mike Graham. But I thought it was a really interesting episode about an era of pro wrestling I didn't know a whole lot about. We talk and we laugh about my uncle with the West Virginia Wildflower satellite dish recording championship wrestling from Florida, narrated by, you know, hosted by Gordon Soley. And I'd get these brown bag videotapes full of wrestling from all over the country from my uncle's satellite dish. And man, anytime it was Florida, 83, 84, 85, I always loved watching that stuff. Kevin Sullivan, with his crew of demons down there in Florida, feuding with Dusty Rhodes, Exotic Adrian Street, feuding with Dusty Rhodes, Mike Graham. But when Dusty left and went to the Carolinas, that was like that was it for Florida.
Well, and I think also that the Grahams, you know, in ring, but also out of the ring. I mean, you're talking about some of the best bookers of all time, you know, and ran that territory, and some of those, you know, Dusty. I mean, I feel like that's like the Grahams are part of what got Dusty over. And again, I hate this, but it was like one of the most telling parts is that I believe it was Mike Graham was the youngest and the final one that he had his driver's license suspended under 2 different names. For DUIs. He had licenses achieved for Mike Graham and then also Mike whatever their last name was, and he'd been pulled over so many times for DUIs that they had both licenses suspended, and that says a lot about the struggle that these guys go through. But then also, like, the police let that happen, you know. I mean, there's just like there was
the good old days,
knowingly or unknowingly, you know, knowingly or unknowingly, they perhaps didn't even know any better.
I mean, a lot of people, they'll be on their 9th DUI and they'll plead it down to DUI first. And you know, another thing, thinking about that, the granddaughter of Eddie Graham is on there. You know, everybody is loved by everybody's loved by someone. You know, that to us, it's Mike Graham, and you know, it's all this wrestling stuff. To her, Andre the Giant's asleep on the couch in there and she's scared to death. You know, it's just kind of, that's, you know, but she loved her dad and she loved her grandpa, and everybody's loved by somebody.
That's a good takeaway from all of these, actually, all these seasons, and this one especially, is that, you know, deep down, these are all real people and they're family members to somebody, even though they're heroes to us, as we've talked about. You know, they're the people that we put on a pedestal. But to a few people, that's their brother or their sister or their father or brother. You know, I mean, that's the humanizing part of all of this, and a glimpse that we get from Dark Side of the Ring, for sure.
Yeah. Jesus and Mama loved him.
That's right. No doubt. No doubt. Well, I hope you've loved this video for us here on the House of Kayfabe. Thanks for watching this far. For the other Steve, and of course, the most professional lawyer, Stephen P. New, here on the House of Kayfabe. We'll see you next time right here on YouTube.